Hi everyone, it's Nick Marzano and this is Local Nation. We have a great interview episode for you today. I'm talking with Bob Phillips, Executive Director of Common Cause North Carolina, about gerrymandering in his state and how it fits into a story that's playing out across the country. The U.S. Constitution doesn't waste a whole lot of ink on local and state government, as we've talked about in previous episodes. However, it does require states' legislatures to take a look at the population every 10 years, usually after the national census, and draw up new district lines for state and congressional races. There are only a couple of requirements as far as the federal government is concerned. Lines should be drawn so that votes count equally. That means that each district should have about the same number of people in it. Hence the need to redraw every so often as populations shift. One person, one vote is the principle here. Also, it requires that states make sure congressional districts, which might be different, by the way, than state districts, it requires that those are single member. States can't have one district of voters elect two of their representatives in Congress. There are a couple of other requirements. The districts the states draw need to be contiguous, for example, but practically speaking, the Constitution pretty much leaves it up to states to determine how they get there, though it does reserve the right for Congress to intervene. Some states let legislators go nuts and draw lines on their own, same as any other bill. Other states commission consultants to draw the lines, but in a lot of cases, these commissions don't have sole authority. They're advisors to a legislative process and might themselves consist of partisan members. Now, a lot of people have described partisan control of redistricting like letting the fox guard the henhouse, and let's just say the feathers have really been flying lately. Have you ever followed the rules to a game to the letter, but exploited a little loophole to win? That's the basic principle behind gerrymandering. The party in power of a state government when redistricting time comes around, and Democrats and Republicans are both guilty here, that party works within the rules of the Constitution to get an electoral advantage over the other party. The name here comes from Elbridge Gerry, a founding father and vice president under James Madison. He also served as governor of Massachusetts. In 1812, he signed a bill into law creating this strangely shaped and curiously partisan district. A newspaper cartoon at the time compared it to a salamander, and the portmanteau gerrymander was born. Now, the two main techniques are still the same today, packing and cracking. Packing crams more voters into a district than necessary to win an election. You give up a landslide in one district to get those voters out of other areas. Cracking is the opposite. You draw lines that spread out the opposing party across the districts that you want to win. You dilute their influence in those districts. The one difference these days is that legislators have access to complex computer programs to help them maximize wins through packing and cracking. Now, back in 2015, the Washington Post put together a great visualization of how this works in practice, better than I can definitely give you over the podcast, so I'm going to link to that in the show notes. So, partisan gerrymandering isn't expressly prohibited by the Constitution, but does it violate the broader terms of those rules? Well, in the past couple of years, there have been a number of suits filed at state and federal courts claiming it does indeed violate those rules and potentially the First and 14th Amendment of the Constitution. These suits have had some success, and the idea of a judicial fix to gerrymandering seems to have gained momentum. On January 22nd of this year, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court struck down the 2011 map drawn by Republicans on the grounds that it violated the state constitution. Cases in Wisconsin and Maryland have both been appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and so the nation is waiting with bated breath to see what decision they hand down this May or June. And that brings us back to today's interview with Bob Phillips of Common Cause North Carolina. Common Cause is a national nonprofit founded in 1970 to promote honest, open, and accountable government in Washington and state capitals. Under Bob's leadership, Common Cause filed a suit at the lower federal court alleging that partisan maps drawn to benefit Republicans in North Carolina had violated the U.S. Constitution. They were recently handed a victory which threw out those gerrymandered maps and ordered an immediate redraw. I spoke with Bob just days after that January announcement, and then a few days after we spoke, the Supreme Court granted the North Carolina legislature a stay on redrawing those maps until they had had a chance to review the decision. The Supreme Court doesn't hear new cases until October of each year, so as we wait for decisions on Wisconsin and Maryland, it's likely that North Carolina's fate is hanging in the balance. So with that background, let's get to the interview. Bob, first of all, thanks so much for joining me on the Local Nation podcast. Thanks for coming on the show to talk to us about gerrymandering.
Sure, Nick. I'm happy to be here with you.
So how would you describe the effects of partisan and racial gerrymandering on North Carolina's state houses and the voting public itself over the past couple of decades?
Well, we always say that it basically denies the citizens of North Carolina, the voters, a voice and a choice on Election Day. Because the lines are manipulated and have been by both political parties when one is in the power and the other is not, the lines are drawn in such a way where there really is no competition by and large in either our legislative or congressional districts. So you have that harm, and then you also have a lot of confusion when there are lawsuits and elections are delayed. People increasingly here in North Carolina have a sense that somehow something isn't right, and somehow, some way, we need to correct this, what we call a broken redistricting system we have here.
So this topic feels like it's gained a lot of attention lately. When did the general public in North Carolina really start taking notice of gerrymandering? Was there a specific election where you feel like it got picked up and became part of the public conversation?
It may not be fair to say this, but I think it actually picked up steam following the 2010 election when the shift in power occurred here. The Democrats historically had controlled both chambers for decades, and then the Republicans took both chambers in 2010. And I think part of it was where, as each successive election cycle occurred, there was a little bit more of an extreme agenda being pushed through in the eyes of many people. The so-called bathroom bill, HB2, which some of your listeners may remember regarding North Carolina, was passed, and we did some analysis and found out that 90% of the lawmakers who supported it had either run unopposed or had won their race with a double-digit margin. Kind of a byproduct of what gerrymandering can do. So, as more of the things that were being passed by a legislature seemed to be playing to a base, in this case, sort of a extreme base on the right, I think people began to take more notice of it. So relatively recently in North Carolina, this has become an issue where more and more people are aware of the problem.
So walk us through what has to happen to change that, at least in your state, in North Carolina, and where the process is today.
Well, a couple things. We're winning in the courts, and we've had racial gerrymandering lawsuits and challenges that have forced the legislature to redraw both our congressional and legislative maps in this decade. We may be the only state in America with that distinction. And then most recently, Common Cause was the plaintiff in the partisan gerrymander challenge, and we were the second federal court ever where a federal court has said partisan gerrymandering is indeed unconstitutional. Those cases are very significant because it does tighten up the rules, the criteria. But what we believe we also must have is statutory, that is, the legislature passing a bill that also brings reform, and principally, who draws the maps. A very familiar soundbite, if you will, is lawmakers should not be drawing their own districts. These court wins do not speak to that, and that's where we will have to have the legislature come back and pass reform that really addresses who draws the maps and also maybe some other criteria. But it's a combination of the General Assembly here passing legislation and these court wins being upheld, interpreted, and also applied.
Yeah, so you mentioned that the federal court decision is really focusing on the outcome and not necessarily on the process. What is that decision and potentially the upcoming Supreme Court decision on redistricting in Wisconsin? What does that mean for states like ours, for Pennsylvania and North Carolina?
Well, if the High Court affirms the lower court's decision in Wisconsin and North Carolina, and as you know, there is a Maryland challenge also based on partisan gerrymandering. And then, of course, I know with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's recent decision. But if the Supreme Court agrees that partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional, that's a big change, because then lawmakers or the people who draw the maps are restricted from looking at political data to draw those districts. And that's everything. That's really what it's about. That is looking at areas and how they perform and then drawing those districts to, in a manipulative way, to gain advantage. They do it in Pennsylvania just like they do it here in North Carolina, just like they do it in Wisconsin, and literally every state that does not have reform. So that would be a big change. The problem we feel, though, is if you still let the lawmakers, i.e. the gerrymanderers, the party in power, still do that, they're going to do everything they can to game the system. They're going to walk right up to the line as far as they can go. And in our view, it would be better to then have some independent entity. It could be an independent citizens commission. It could be civil servant, nonpartisan employees like the state of Iowa utilizes. It could be like a lottery system as California does. But that's what has to happen in our mind to complement what the courts are beginning to say, and that is that partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional.
And so with that approach, that's going to be a legislative approach state by state, right? How hard is it going to be to get state legislators to pass laws against their own interest?
Well, I think each state is different, and a lot of it has to be, what is happening in those states. In North Carolina, we feel like we have sort of the club of a growing state with rapidly changing demographics. And unfortunately, the party in power is generally not motivated to, as you mentioned, go against their own interests unless they fear uncertainty. They're never going to do this for, quote, the right reasons, unfortunately, but it could be that they fear they may lose power and that they may even lose power in that very important year of that ends in zero when it's all about, that party has the power to draw the maps. So basically, we're kind of also reminding the majority party here in North Carolina, jump on this reform. It is your insurance policy, because if you don't, and we can't stop it, the party that you gerrymandered is going to come back and do the very same thing to you, and worse if they can. Now, that works in North Carolina because, again, of our changing demographics and the growth we have. I don't know, maybe it could work in Pennsylvania, maybe it could work in Wisconsin, but I think that there is definitely the strong possibilities of states doing this if the circumstances are right, to answer your question.
So in this fight for the cases that are currently in federal courts, what has Common Cause's approach been? Has it been mostly focused on these suits? Have you been working with legislators? Or have you been engaging with citizens on a grassroots level? What sort of tactics have you had in your tool belt, and what have you found to be most effective?
It's a great question because it has changed recently for Common Cause North Carolina. Probably much like Common Cause Pennsylvania, we seek to educate the public as much as possible and build, a groundswell of grass tops support. That can only go so far, however. So we also then try to target what we call grass tops. Those are kind of the civic and business people who might have the ability to influence lawmakers quietly in some cases, but it's kind of then the combination of grassroots, grass tops. We've done outreach to local elected people. Those are the mayors and the city councilors, and where we have maybe majority party leaders who are against any kind of reform, but their mayor, their councilors in their hometowns, or their county commissioners in their home counties are for this. So we've kind of been putting together local elected leaders for redistricting reform, and that's a growing list. The reason why we decided to take legal action was when the lawmakers here in North Carolina were so blatant and bold about what they were doing. In February of 2016, when they were under the court order to draw new congressional maps, and we have 13 congressional districts, by the way, they had previously gerrymandered those seats to where it was a 10 Republican, 3 Democratic split, even though we are a purple state. And prior to the gerrymander for successive election cycles, it had been evenly split, 7-6, 6-7, 8-5, kind of that. Suddenly it was 10-3, and in February 2016, when they were having to draw new maps, they said, this is a partisan gerrymander. We don't make any bones about it. And the only reason why it's 10-3 is because we couldn't draw it 11-2. I mean, it was just amazingly how cynical and bold a statement that was. And we thought, we're done trying to work with you all in the legislature because we know you're not going to work with us. We're going to sue. That's not to say that we're still not going to continue to push a reform bill, and we have one, and it does have bipartisan support. But that's kind of the context of what Common Cause North Carolina has done, a combination of building support, educating the public, educating, again, those leaders in the communities, and again, considering that option of taking legal action as we see fit to do so.
And so that legal platform, your hope is that it creates the burning platform that forces the issues for legislators to then act, some might say against their own short-term interests, but that these suits could be the impetus for some action at the state level?
It could, because again, it's given us a boost and a lot of energy just amongst the people. And when you have some of these folks who might be big funders, I mean, the people who fund the campaign of the leadership, but they begin to think, this just isn't really going well for us. And, there's an acknowledgement that extreme legislation governed by a party that's manipulated the lines to get that power isn't healthy for North Carolina. And that could be on either side. People worry about the so-called brand of North Carolina. So we are hoping to, again, appealing to the folks who can influence the leadership, again, maybe quietly, but the lawsuits, the success helps play into that because it gives them a belief things are changing. We need to get on board. Maybe it's time for our voices to be heard as well.
So I was reading this book from by Bill Bishop. It's a little old. It's from 2008. It's called The Big Sort. He's talking about the dramatic migrations of Americans towards places with people who think and who vote like they do. He minimized the overall impact or hope for gerrymandering reform on American voting patterns, saying that many Americans are eventually, they're going to be clustering next to like-minded voters, like-minded people, and just citing the diminishing number of contested county elections over the past few decades. Others have said they've responded to that part of the book and said it's an oversimplification of the argument. What's your take on that argument? Obviously, this fight is very important to you. Why would you say it's important to North Carolina and to the nation in light of some of the data about migration of voters?
Well, I think there is no question that we are in a time where there seems to be this big sort happening. And again, folks seem to be so much more, desiring or kind of going toward folks who are like-minded. I have seen that, and I think that is very true. But how it applies to maps, I mean, I would say this. One, when you are talking about congressional districts, and here in North Carolina, those districts are dependent upon, where the population is. I mean, I guess in some of our population centers, it can be a partial county, but many times they are areas that cut across counties and include both towns, cities, and rural areas. So I'm not so certain that it's always the case in congressional that you're going to have one way or the other. I mean, I think there are safe seats that are always going to be safe in the foreseeable future. But I also think that, again, it's not stagnant. And I'll just use North Carolina as an example. We are, with the changing economy here, seeing towns that are being sort of reinvented. Maybe the economy is changing as they become tourism sites, or young people not being able to afford to live in an expensive city, but they can commute in, and they're living in what might have been a textile town, but has some attractions, and there are things that are kind of going there. The fact that our population is shifting in part because of people wanting to be amongst like-minded folks is one thing, but we're also seeing in North Carolina, again, shifts in where young people particularly, might be choosing to live because of, affordability and quality of life. We also have a emerging Latino population here in North Carolina. They tend to be locating in rural areas because of the work. But as these folks come of age to where they can become citizens, or some are already able to vote. They may tend to vote maybe opposite from what a lot of people may think of as a rural North Carolina voter. So I think there is a big sort happening, but I don't think you can say, well, that negates the ability to have any kind of effectiveness of reform. Maybe some states might be different, but I think in North Carolina, as I mentioned before, our changing demographics sort of means that reform can work here, is my belief.
Bob, once again, thank you so much for spending some time talking about gerrymandering and the work of Common Cause North Carolina. If our listeners are interested in getting in touch with Common Cause North Carolina or Common Cause National, how can they reach out?
Easiest way is, just commoncauseinc.org is the easy way. That's our website. We have lots of information on our website about what we've just talked about, and there's certainly an ability to contact me. And if anybody wants to contact the national office, commoncause.org, or, I can help them contact the national office as well. So that would be the easiest way. We welcome interest and support and questions from anyone. So again, I would invite anyone to contact us if they have comments or questions.
Thanks one more time to Bob Phillips. If you're interested in learning more about Common Cause, look for a link in the show notes at www.localnation.org. If you're listening from Pennsylvania, you probably already know about Fair Districts PA and Philadelphia's own Committee of 70, both of whom have been working for better redistricting in my home state. I'll link out to those as well. In fact, recently there's been a lot of action in that case. The PA General Assembly missed the deadline to file a redrawn map, and so the PA Supreme Court actually commissioned and released a new district map of their own on February 19th. Challenges have begun, but it looks like this map is going to stand through this year's election. I'll link to a great article that includes an overlay of the old and new maps so you can see for yourself how bizarre these old lines used to be. That's all for now. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at Local Nation Show, like the show on Facebook at Local Nation Podcast, and if you like what you've heard in these first few episodes and you want to hear more, I ask humbly, please leave a rating and a review on iTunes or Stitcher. In the meantime, thanks for listening and for being an above-average citizen.